It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers who will be joining me on this panel. Tania Lombrozo is the Arthur Marks Professor and Associate Chair of Psychology, as well as the Director of the Concepts and Cognition Lab at Princeton University. And in addition to her work on cognitive approaches to the study of religion, I'm excited about her work that's sort of meta. It goes up a level. It's also, she studies the cognitive scientific approaches to the study of people's reasoning about science and the interaction between science and religion as well. So sort of a cognitive science of science and religion, if that's a thing. But it's a thing, and it's becoming more of a thing all the time, and she's really helping to lead the way in that. Our second panelist is Gordon Grafman, Director of the Brain Injury Research Center and Chief of the Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab and Professor of Neurology, Psychiatry, and Behavioral Sciences, Cognitive Neurology, and Alzheimer's Disease Center. Wow, keeps going and going at Northwestern University. He does a lot of stuff, but what I'm really excited about tonight is his work looking at how different neural structures seem to play a key role in certain kinds of religious and mystical thought experiences and so forth. So we've got with us tonight someone who takes cognitive approaches to the study of religion and science, and somebody who takes neuroscientific approaches to the study of religion. And we're going to get them talking to each other, and maybe they'll let me get in a word edgewise as well if I behave myself. So we'll turn it over to Tania for about 15 minutes, then Gordon will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to go into a discussion. So Tania, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the organizers for bringing us all together to get to think about this topic together. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and having an opportunity to discuss together. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about how to think about the relationship between cognitive science, and in particular, what happens when cognitive science meets the topic of religious belief. Now, the scientific study of religion, sometimes the pseudoscientific study of religion, is of course nothing new. There have been efforts in anthropology, sociology, psychology to gain a social scientific understanding of religious practices, of religious belief, and religious experience. But over the last couple of decades, there have been some really important advances in our understanding of the mind. And these have stemmed in part from the growth of cognitive science and from neuroscience, which have really grown into mature scientific disciplines. And through a relatively new field that was already mentioned, the cognitive science of religion, we've learned all sorts of things about the cognitive bases for religious belief, including, for example, how we conceptualize God or gods and how that affects our beliefs. And I think these advances give rise to the topic of today's roundtable, namely, how do cognitive science and neuroscience interface with religion? Now, those of you who attended the last roundtable with Elaine Eklund know that for many people, and I'm guessing many people in this audience, and certainly for many scientists, science and religion are not perceived to conflict. But when we turn to psychological and neuroscientific explanations for religious belief itself, explanations for religious experience, I think we sometimes see what looks like a kind of perceived threat, a sort of tension in the way people reason about this domain. And so what I'd like to do in my short time with you today is to walk you through some of the research from my lab that's looked at this topic, at this perceived threat that might emerge from a scientific explanation for religious belief. Specifically, the questions I want to focus on are whether people think religious belief might fall beyond the scope of science, such that we cannot or perhaps should not pursue a scientific approach to religious belief, whether scientific explanations for religious belief are sometimes taken to threaten or debunk religious belief, and then more generally, whether people think some things, religion among them, perhaps should remain a mystery, should not be topics of inquiry. I should say at the outset that the research that I'm going to be talking about today was overwhelmingly conducted with participants from the United States. So while I'll be talking about religion and religious belief to keep things simple, overwhelmingly this sample is, when religious, a Christian sample. And so for the most part, religious belief here is going to mean canonical Christian beliefs, and religion is going to mean Christianity in the contemporary United States. And so, of course, a really important question that we have to keep in mind is whether or not this is going to generalize to other religions, other religious contexts, and other populations. And I'm hoping that's something that we'll get to discuss. All right, so let me first try to illustrate some of the psychological forces that I think might be at work in the kinds of questions that I raised. And to do that, I want to introduce you to the Golden Fleece Award, which some of you might be familiar with. This was initiated in 1975 by US Senator William Proxmire. And he wanted to recognize those who are putatively fleecing taxpayers with unneeded research. And the first recipient of this award was the National Science Foundation, and they won this dubious honor for awarding $84,000 for research into the psychology of love and romantic relationships. And here's what Proxmire wrote in explaining his choice. He wrote, "I object to this, not only because no one, not even the National Science Foundation, can argue that falling in love is a science, not only because I'm sure that even if they spent 84 million or 84 billion, they wouldn't get an answer that anyone would believe. I'm also against it because I don't want the answer. I believe that 200 million other Americans want to leave some things in life a mystery. And right on top of the things we don't want to know is why a man falls in love with a woman and vice versa." Now, I want you to notice here in this quote that the desire for ignorance, the desire for some things to remain a mystery. Now, Proxmire's target here was research on romantic love. But a PhD student and I several years ago began to hypothesize that this tendency to regard some human psychological phenomena as falling beyond the scope of science might be much more general and extend to things including religious belief and spiritual experience. And so this led us to pursue a series of studies where we investigated the perceived limits of science when it comes to explaining these kinds of aspects of the human mind. In one of our studies, what we did was present participants with a really broad range of psychological phenomena. So along the x-axis here, I've just presented a subset of the kinds of things that we considered. And we asked people to make a couple of judgments. So one thing that we asked them was whether or not science will one day be able to fully explain that phenomenon. So for example, to what extent do you agree that one day science will be able to fully explain falling in love, believing in God, depression, and so on? We also asked them whether they were uncomfortable with the idea that science could one day fully explain each of these phenomena. So for example, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that science could one day fully explain religious belief or could fully explain depth perception and so on. And the way I'm going to show you these data, these are reverse coded so that the more possible something is perceived to be and the more comfortable somebody is with it, the higher the ratings are. So we received a range of answers, both for how possible thought these phenomena were for science to one day fully explain, and the extent to which they were comfortable with this. So for example, people on average thought that science could fully explain things like depth perception, forgetting, depression, many sensory kinds of capacities, and so on. And they were quite comfortable with the idea that science could do this. But I want to draw your attention to this other extreme over here, where we have items like believing in God, falling in love, spiritual experience fell here as well. And what you can see here is that people thought that these were the kinds of phenomena that they were least inclined to think that science could fully explain, and that they were most uncomfortable with the idea of science explaining. So returning to our key questions here, we see evidence that at least on average, people think religious belief is more likely than other kinds of psychological phenomena to fall beyond the scope of what science can explain. And moreover, that at least for some people, a scientific explanation for belief would be uncomfortable and thus presumably unwelcome. What we did in this research was go on to try to identify what it is about things like religious belief and spiritual experience and falling in love that differentiates these phenomena from phenomena more like depth perception and motor control and depression, where people seem to be quite happy to think that science could provide a full explanation. And I'm happy to tell you more about this in the Q&A, but I do want to give you at least a quick summary of some of the key insights there. So one of the things that we found is that it didn't really have much to do with the perceived complexity of the phenomenon. So it wasn't just that some things were perceived to be difficult to study and complex. Rather, people thought that science might not be able to explain those things that make humans unique or humans exceptional relative to other kinds of species. And they tended to think that science couldn't explain those things that are characterized by some sort of introspectively accessible internal experience. So this line of work leads us to the question of how people respond to scientific explanations for religious belief when they are in fact offered. So for example, consider these headlines that were reporting recent results on the psychology and neuroscience of belief and spirituality. These aren't particularly special. They're just the ones that I found when I did a Google News search using a few key terms in the last week. And they might seem innocuous enough, but when you dig deeper behind these kinds of headlines, you often find sentiments like the following. Their transcendent experiences are actually seizures. She thinks she believes in God. In fact, it's just chemical reactions taking place in the neurons in her temporal lobes. Religious experience and belief in God are merely the results of electrical anomalies in the human brain. In all of these cases, it looks like the scientific explanation is taken to somehow threaten the truth of the religious belief or to undermine the reality of the religious experience. I first became really intrigued by cases like this in conversation with a religious friend. She and I disagreed about something that might seem rather important. I'm an atheist and my friend believes in a Christian God. But we were entirely in agreement in thinking that research on the cognitive science of religion does not answer the question of whether or not God exists or of whether or not we should believe in the reality of religious experience. So we were baffled by what seemed like a perceived threat to religion from a scientific investigation into its cognitive basis. Now, of course, for an atheist, cognitive science has the potential to provide a sufficient explanation for religious belief and for religious experience. And so we don't need to posit a God outside the human mind to explain belief. But it doesn't follow from the science of religion that God doesn't exist. After all, cognitive science also has the potential to provide a sufficient explanation for our belief in photons and for our experience of light. But it doesn't follow that no photons, no light exists outside the human mind. For a religious believer, it's quite natural to assume that beliefs or experiences of God or other supernatural entities have to be instantiated somehow in the human mind. And so science can naturally illuminate the natural side of that process. So while we were convinced that scientific explanations of religious belief are in fact typically not threatening or debunking of that belief, we decided to explore the empirical hypothesis that as a matter of psychological fact, people might sometimes take them to be so. And we were interested in whether or not this happened, and if so, under what conditions. So this led to a collaborative research project on when and why people think beliefs are debunked by scientific explanations of their origins. And in this work, we considered canonical religious beliefs like belief in God, but we also looked more generally at other kinds of moral and scientific beliefs as well. So in our studies, we presented participants with a case of an individual who learns about a scientific explanation for a particular belief that he holds, for example, his belief in God. And we then asked participants whether that explanation should affect the individual's confidence that that belief is true, right? Should it have no effect? Should it make that person more confident? Should it make them less confident that that belief is true? Where the thought is that if it makes them think if somebody thinks that they should be less confident, then they perceive some sort of threat in that explanation for the truth of the belief. So across a broad range of cases, we found a common pattern. When people were offered an explanation for some belief that suggested that it was the result of an abnormal process, like mini seizures in the domain of neuroscience, or an abnormal genetic mutation, or an attachment disorder, or a particular cognitive bias, in these cases, they tended to think that this person's confidence should either remain the same or sometimes decrease. So in some of these cases, there was a perceived threat to the belief, as we'd hypothesized, and as the media reports of the science of religious belief that I just quoted seemed to imply. But when the scientific explanation for belief did not appeal to or imply abnormality, for instance, when it simply involved some particular type of neural activity or a particular gene variant or the absence of a developmental disorder, and so on. In these cases, our participants thought that if anything, these scientific explanations for belief should actually make the person more confident. They should reinforce the belief, not threaten it. So if we return to these headlines here, we'd expect a claim like this one to be pretty innocuous or even welcome to religious believers. By contrast, a claim like this one, which links spirituality to abnormality by way of an injury, could potentially be perceived as a threat to religion or religious belief. So it looks like the answer to this question is that people are pretty sophisticated about how they perceive the implications of scientific explanations for religious belief. And in fact, many scientific explanations are seen as perfectly consistent with and possibly supportive of the truth of those beliefs. All right, my final topic in my last few minutes is mystery. And it ties back to Proxmire's claim that in some cases, we may want things to remain a mystery, or at least be comfortable with the idea of mystery. So in this project, we looked at people's attitudes towards mystery and explanation. And this was part of a larger investigation into the roles of evidence and inquiry across domains. In one of the studies in the series, what we did was present participants with questions from a variety of domains, including religion and science. And we asked them to offer one of two ratings for each of these questions. So some participants received an answer to the question where the answer was, it's a mystery. And they were asked to say how good this was as an answer. So just to try to get your intuitions about this, imagine being asked, why is there a God? It's a mystery. You might not think that's a very good answer or a very good explanation, but compare your judgment on that case to, why do continents move? It's a mystery. And that seems completely inappropriate as an explanation, right? So when we asked participants to make this judgment, we found that on average, these mystery claims were much more acceptable for religion than for science. So what you're seeing here is several domains that we tested along the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you're saying, sort of, how okay is it to just appeal to mystery when you're trying to answer these questions? Nobody loves mystery. These are our lowest ratings on our 6-point scale here. But you can see quite reliable domain differences. For religion and the supernatural, it's sort of reasonable to appeal to mystery. For science, health, and math, people thought this was not appropriate at all. For reasons we can discuss in the Q&A, philosophy and psychology fell between these. These are my disciplines, so I'm not sure how I feel about this. The other thing that we asked, though, was sort of the flip side of mystery, was to what extent do you think a question in each of these domains really demands an explanation? And when we asked that, we found the reverse pattern. When it came to questions in the domains of science and math and health, people thought that these questions really demanded an explanation. But when it came to religion as well as the supernatural, they were much less inclined to think that an explanation was required. Again, the other domains fell in between. So in follow-up studies, we found that the difference between science and religion couldn't be explained just by differing levels of confidence in the premises of these questions. So for example, it was the case that on average, people were less confident that God exists than they were that continents move. But that wasn't what accounted for this variation in attitudes towards mystery and explanation. We also found that people were more willing to accept these mystery claims when they thought the answer to a given question was beyond human comprehension, and when they thought it was a question that people shouldn't try to answer. So it looks like judgments about mystery and explanation reflect our assumptions about the nature of each of these domains. Consistent with the previous work I showed you, for at least some people, religion isn't a potential or appropriate target for inquiry. But in this case, the limits have to do with inquiry within the domain itself, that is, offering answers to religious questions, not to scientific explanations for religious phenomena, as in the previous cases that I discussed. The final project I want to tell you about briefly picks up on a potentially puzzling feature of these data, at least puzzling to me. So on the one hand, it's perhaps not surprising that we associate mystery with religion, and that in the case of science, declaring something a mystery could be deemed inappropriate or a sign of some kind of failure. On the other hand, science is all about the unknown, about recognizing our ignorance, about quantifying our uncertainty. So while mystery may be anathema to science, other forms of ignorance are par for the course. So motivated by this observation, we investigated whether science and religion are perceived differently in response to different forms of ignorance. A different way to put this is that if you think of science and religion as different ways of knowing, might they have correspondingly different ways of not knowing, different forms of ignorance associated with them? So to create the right conditions to test this, we wanted to find questions where participants would endorse the premise, but not take themselves to already have the answer to the question. And so what we did is that we presented participants with a series of questions, again, about science and religion. And we tried to identify for each participant a phenomenon in this domain that they believed in, but that they didn't understand the mechanism behind. So for example, a belief would qualify if a participant did believe that God answers prayers, but said that they did not know how and why this happens. Once we had a belief like that identified, what we could do was present them with a a candidate expert in this domain where the expert offered one of two answers. Either it's a mystery or it's unknown, a form of ignorance, but one that doesn't appeal to mystery. And what we did is that we asked participants whether this claim of ignorance was threatening in the sense that it threatened religion or religious belief, or made religion or religious belief seem less important or valuable. And we asked the corresponding set of questions for science. We asked several different kinds of questions about value and importance and threat, and these correlated very highly with each other. So I'm just going to show you a composite of how threatening people found these answers that appealed to ignorance, where higher scores are that they found it more threatening to that belief. And what you can see when the response was, it's a mystery, is something that's consistent with what I showed you a moment ago. The mystery claim was less okay, or you can think about this as more threatening for science than it was for religion. But when ignorance was instead expressed with it's unknown, this domain difference entirely disappeared. So it really seems to have to do with a particular kind of ignorance, or whatever it is that mystery entails, not merely with the absence of an answer. So once again, this suggests that there may be important differences across domains, such that religion, at least compared to science, is more comfortable with mystery, but no more comfortable with other forms of ignorance. So combined with other work, we think this suggests that our folk theories of science and religion involve different kinds of epistemic commitments, that is, different assumptions about what we can know and how we can know it. And that when it comes to religion, we're often governed by non-epistemic goals and norms. Putting it differently, religion might be shaped to a large extent by community and morality and other kinds of human concerns, other than the kind of epistemic inquiry that guides our scientific norms. So I've tried to cover a lot of ground in a little bit of time, and I've only been able to present a small subset of the findings from each of these lines of work. But I hope we can delve more deeply into these questions and others in the Q&A. I just want to end by zooming out to the larger question with which we began. So as we've seen, cognitive science not only offers new tools for understanding the origins and the persistence of religious belief, but I think it also sheds light on how we understand the relationship between science and religion, and how we understand the very enterprise of offering a scientific explanation for religious belief or for religious experience and religious practice. I've focused more on the psychology than on neuroscience, since that's my areas of expertise, but I'm really eager to hear Jordan Grafman's presentation next, which will introduce more neuroscience, and then discuss with Justin Barrett, who, as you've heard, was himself one of the leading contributors to the cognitive science of religion. So I'll end there with a thanks to you for your attention, and to the Templeton Foundation for funding some of the work that I just shared with you today.
Okay, good evening, everybody. And it's Jordan, not Gordon, Justin. like the river, like Michael Jordan. So thanks, everybody, for staying with us tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about our research into religion and the human brain. And I got into it because I've long been interested, as it says here, in the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes of the human brain. And in particular, because it differentiates us from other animals. And we also see that in its complexity and its disproportionately increased size compared to other brain regions. We know, based on 100 years of study, that this area of the brain is also important for modulating our reactions to provocations in the world. But a big question has been and continues to be, what are the representations in those neural networks that enforce this modulation? So my hypothesis has been that representations concerning all forms of social and narrative memories and beliefs are mainly stored in that area of the brain. So given that, my lab started investigating all sorts of beliefs, moral, legal, economic, and political beliefs. At the same time, I knew religious beliefs were among the most complex of social beliefs, and evolutionary influence. And as far as we knew, no other animal has a similar belief system. But I had to wait for a postdoc who finally arrived in my lab 15 years ago to pursue this, and then away we went. So tonight I'm going to provide you with a brief rationale for our cognitive neuroscience research, talk about a couple of studies we conducted, and provide a few summary remarks, and then leave you with a sampling of questions that remain unanswered, at least in my view. So The human brain has evolved into local regions that tend to perform specialized functions. And those local regions enter into distributed networks that perform more generalized functions, particularly in the service of social behavior. We assume that, like other aspects of human cognition, religious cognition co-opts some of these same regions and networks to enable its representation and the expression of religious beliefs. But religious cognition has a degree of complexity that may award it some special status. And this is one of the things we kept our eyes open for. If you look at the brain and you look at different structures that may be concerned with social behavior, here's an example of that. If you look at the keys to the left, you can see a number of structures color-coded then on the human brain where they're localized. And these structures tend to be concerned with higher order cognition, emotion, human memory, decision-making. The individual structures that you see in the key at the top then coalesce into networks that are often given assignments, networks that might have to do, like the amygdala network, perhaps, with relevance to you as an individual or with the emotions you're feeling, or like fear, for example. There are other networks concerned with mentalizing, thinking, other networks concerned with empathy, and other networks, for example, concerned with your understanding of other people's actions. So we've seen these networks based on all sorts of neuroscience approaches, and people feel pretty confident about their existence. So a couple of questions that seem both easy and not so easy to try to answer. Is there a God spot or some afterlife instinct that can be identified in the human brain? This is not, at first, you might think, well, that's silly maybe, but is it so silly? If humans are unique in having this kind of complex religious belief, and if you actually read religious texts, is there something special in our brain, for example, compared to, say, your doggy's brain, if you have dogs, that enables us to understand supernatural beings as they convey to us information? A more mundane question is there a relationship between the local regions and networks that I just described that govern other aspects of social cognition and religious cognition? So the neuroscience approach, and I just want to make it clear, complements other approaches. It is not the only approach. It is not a unique approach. It simply complements other approaches to understand human social behavior, community formation, and religious beliefs. Now, my own view of this is that this is extremely sensitive research because, frankly, when you're dealing with religion, you're dealing with our ability to rationalize why we were born, why we exist, and what's going to happen when we die. And I think there's very few other belief systems that are so fragile for us. And I think that's something that leads us to be very careful and when we do our research. So the first study I'm going to talk about briefly uses functional neuroimaging. So you put somebody in an MRI scanner. The scanner basically records electrical activity via changes in oxygenation in local regions of the brain. So if that area of the brain is active in the task, it needs more oxygen in essence. And that oxygen can then be reflected in visual images that show you activation in those regions. That's a simple explanation. In this study, we actually did two studies. The first part of this study was to take sentences, items, statements from the Baylor Institute of Religious Studies survey from 2006. And we simply asked people to see how similar, to make similarity ratings between all the statements. And then you can do a statistical analysis called multidimensional scaling, and that allows you to pick out the dimensions from all the statements. How do they fall together, in essence, or fall differently in some cases? In our study, in this behavioral study, we found three main dimensions: God's perceived level of involvement in personal and earthly matters, God's perceived emotion, and religious knowledge, either doctrinaire, where you sort of studied and learned about it, or experiential, where something happened to you that led you to believe deeply, have deep religious thoughts and experience. In the second study, we took all these statements, and while people were sitting in the scanner and their brain activity was being recorded, we asked them to just simply say whether they agreed or disagreed with each statement while their brain was being imaged. Now, we had a control condition, but I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight. The images are on the left, and it's a well-known phenomena in science that if you show pretty pictures like that, they're more believable. So I'm less interested in showing you the fancy pictures with the activation. Look up the article if you want. It's in, or ask me and I'll send it to you. It's in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But we basically had three main findings here. When we looked at the dimension that involved God's perceived level of involvement in personal and earthly matters, what we found activated were brain regions that tend to be activated in non-religious tasks that involve theory of mind, your ability to perceive what somebody else is thinking. So that's the first finding. The second finding was when people read statements and agreed or disagreed with them regarding God's perceived emotion, that activated temporal lobe regions well known, and a few others, well known for emotion perception and processing. An expected finding, like the first one. When we looked at religious knowledge on a doctrinaire to experiential continuum, that tended to activate structures either concerned with imagery in the case of experience, again, that might be expected, and language areas concerned with doctrinaire knowledge and also episodic memory for both. In general, and this was interesting to us, believers and non-believers had similar patterns of activation. So it really didn't matter whether they believed or not. It looked like they were using the same cognitive processes. However, the one distinction was when believers read a statement that they disagreed with, they had much more activation of structures concerned with emotion. So that was an activation study with healthy volunteers. The findings tend to be are associational. That is, an area of activation is associated with the task, but we don't know if it's necessary. So another approach, one of many, to studying this kind of data involves studying people who have brain damage and looking at the effects of the brain damage on how they perform tasks of interest, in this case, tasks related to religious belief. So in this study, we took male Vietnam veterans who had penetrating traumatic brain injuries when they served in Vietnam. I've been studying these guys for 4 decades now. They're very loyal. They asked, why do we want to know about their religious beliefs? And we gave them our explanation. They said, let's go with it. And they're always very involved, partly because they hope what we find out will help veterans in the future who have brain injuries. So they're extremely loyal. Here, what we did was take a scale, a questionnaire involving religious fundamentalism. It's called the Religious Fundamentalism Scale. We looked at the neo-personality scale and a whole range of cognitive tasks, of which I'm really going to only refer to one. If you look below the title of the paper, you're going to see images, but these are not activation images. This shows you for each group where their lesions overlapped. So this is a lesion mapping picture. And the redder the area, the more the lesions overlapped. At the top is a group that had lesions to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So that, if you look where I'm pointing, the medial is right here and ventral is a little bit below, resting just above the eyes. The second group in the middle had lesions primarily to dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And if you sort of slap your head sometimes because you made a mistake, that's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Please don't hit yourself too hard when you make mistakes. The group below had no prefrontal cortex damage, and that is, in essence, that was our control group, but they had damage to other areas of the brain from penetrating brain injuries. In this case, rather than MRI, we always use CT scans because these people have retained metal in their brain. We can't use MRIs. Here's the finding. If you look to the left, the finding indicates that if you have ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions, you're more likely to have a higher fundamentalism score. You're more likely to have fundamentalist beliefs. If you have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, you're a little bit more likely, but not like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesion patients. The no prefrontal cortex lesion patients just looked like our healthy controls. Also Vietnam veterans who served in Vietnam, but had no penetrating brain injuries. When we looked at both these two regions, we couldn't find any intermediate, we were interested in mediation analysis here. And we couldn't really find any relationship between ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions and this increase in fundamentalism, other than the larger the lesion, the more likely they were going to have stricter fundamentalist beliefs. However, with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, what we found was that the less open you were and the less cognitive flexibility you had, the more likely you were going to demonstrate greater fundamentalist beliefs. And so the idea with those lesions are, they first affect aspects of cognitive processing that later affect how you express your religious beliefs. And that's what's sort of indicated below here, below the figures. So you might remember the image I showed you earlier, which broke up the brain into different areas concerned with different aspects of social cognition. In this recent article, we tried to summarize, not only based on our studies, which are many more than what I just showed you, but also other studies in the literature, what areas of the brain seem important for religious cognition. And this is based both on imaging studies, on studies of patients with brain lesions, also studies using non-invasive brain stimulation, which includes transcranial magnetic stimulation or electrical current stimulation. And there's a whole bunch of other stimulations right around the corner that are coming. So there's a lot of tools that you can use to probe the brain. The bottom line was, when you were rationalizing, if you think about God's intent and emotions, you're going to activate, you're going to need structures that we use ordinarily to understand somebody else's intentions and beliefs. If you are trying to control perceptual phenomena to explain them better, and in this case, perhaps unusual or supernatural phenomena, you're going to use areas in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to downregulate the effects, the perceptual effects, to help provide better explanations. If you are retrieving religious beliefs, you're going to activate areas normally concerned with semantic processing and storage. In some tasks, depending on the tasks, we also find areas related to reward and evaluation activated. And this can often co-occur when you're retrieving newly acquired religious beliefs. And there are often conflicts between your beliefs and what you're experiencing in the world. And those conflicts are often detected in this area labeled ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, that gets activated. So you can start to look at the brain and look at the different areas and systems and networks in the brain that are concerned with different aspects of religious belief. And there are good reasons, I think, to be interested in this. It's clear that religious cognition co-ops brain regions and networks that seem involved in other forms of social cognition, including legal, moral, economic, and political belief systems. These regions notably tend to include the prefrontal cortex and the anterior temporal lobes. In the case of the prefrontal cortex, one of the more developed areas unique to humans. These areas not only may represent beliefs they often exert a modifying influence on other processes, whether it helps emotional regulation. Religious belief often improves health or health outcomes. It can help with reappraisal. And if you have areas that are damaged with reappraisal, you may be less likely to reappraise your thinking or your belief systems, whether it be religious or beliefs or QAnon, for example. So it's all belief systems here that are relevant to these areas of the brain. So findings about which brain regions are involved in religious and other forms of social cognition, I think, also provide indications about how to decompose religious cognition into its constituent parts that are then recombined into distributed networks depending on the environmental contingencies. And in the case of psychologists, those are tasks in the lab. But in the real world, they're what we face every day when we meet friends, when we go outside, if you turn on and watch the news, we're dealing with this all the time. And it also is important for us to better understand how we intentionally and explicitly express religious beliefs, but also how we implicitly process religious beliefs, which then influence our daily behaviors in ways we're not necessarily always aware of, like other sorts of attitudes we have. So I'll leave you with a bunch of outstanding questions. There are many more than these. And one of the reasons I think that we have such questions unanswered is because, honestly, it's hard to get funding for this kind of research from government agencies. And you have to, many people, when they do this kind of research, they have to do it in their spare time, in essence, because they're really interested in these topics. And I personally think there's just about nothing more interesting in the human brain than religious cognition. So I'll stop there.
What you've heard from our two presenters, if you've heard a cognitive scientific approach to the subject matter, you've heard a neuroscientific one. And some themes that I think you've seen come through this are some really helpful observations and sort of corrections for how the scientific study of religion has sort of gone historically and where there's sort of pull. Jordan at the end there suggested the problem with people are having to sort of do this as hobbyists and there's not a lot of funding. And I think that's definitely one of the big obstacles to progress in this area. But another one that I'll note that both Tania and Jordan avoid a problem is treating religion like it is a natural kind, that it is some kind of special domain that's well circumscribed, that's sort of causally encapsulated in some interesting kind of sense. And you might think that's kind of a straw man kind of position, but it is the case that we commonly talk about religion as if it's a thing. Oh, well, religion does this, or this causes religion, because it's a useful heuristic. It's a good folk category. It gets us into the right space pretty quickly. But you notice that both of our panelists then went further in their specification of what do I mean in my studies when I'm talking about religious stuff. And I think that's a critical kind of move for the scientific study of religion. Popularizers often miss that subtlety. And so then they end up with these very kind of bland explanations like, well, religion is a product of evolved cognition. Like, well, that doesn't tell us much at all. Or religion is a product of brain pathology. Again, too vague, too broad. And dangerous in the sense that such explanations of religion, if they're writ so large, often have what I like to call collateral damage. And that is, as Jordan and Tania both pointed out in their own ways, what we see in religious domains of thought overlaps with what we see in other domains of thought. The simple point is that if we're not careful with explanations of religion, and thinking that religion is this sort of encapsulated domain, what we end up doing if we think we're explaining away certain kinds of religious thought as a product of, say, pathology, is we end up getting non-religious thought for free, explained away as well, which should automatically make us tap the brakes and go, are we really explaining away? And Tania already sort of heightened our sensitivities to some of those dynamics. So religion, not a natural kind. it's a heuristic category that gets us into a helpful space to think about. And then we got to get specific. What are we talking about? Mystical experiences, ritualized behaviors, beliefs in supernatural beings? What is it we're talking about? And with what populations? How are they socially and culturally situated? So, I mean, that's one kind of approach that is starting to win the day in scientific approaches to the study of religion, but maybe isn't characterizing our popular media around the study of religion. So that's an observation I wanted to make. A second observation is there are actually many different levels of analysis that we're talking about. We saw two already tonight. We saw the sort of the cognitive level or psychological level, and we saw the neuroscientific level. But you can also cut it a different way, which is are we talking about individual people and their experience, commitments, and thoughts, or are we talking about groups? And interestingly, most of the cognitive science of religion and the evolutionary studies of religion, their unit of analysis is actually groups, not individuals. Now, there's some overlap in these domains. But people like me who work on cognitive science of religion, we're not trying to explain, well, why is it that Bob has religious beliefs like he does? We're trying to explain, why is it that human groups tend to have beliefs in the afterlife? Not why any given individual is higher or lower on afterlife beliefs. And there's a real difference in methodology and approach. And I think there's a difference in implications that we can draw from that. So I just wanted to give a little bit of that landscape background so that we don't talk past each other in the discussion. Because we're talking at different levels or using different units of analysis. But I detect that the three of us anyway have a lot in common with regard to these issues and the kinds of things that interest us. So to kick off the discussion, I thought I'd lob a question in for the two of you to talk to each other about, because I saw threads in your presentations, but even more so in some of the readings or videos you pre-circulated. And I'd like you to react to a body of research that has been looking at the idea that people might vary in their degree of religious commitment or their religiosity based on the degree to which they engage in analytic thought. So Tania can attack this as a cognitive scientist, but Jordan, I noticed you're playing a lot up with those prefrontal cortexes and cortices and those executive functions and how those might be then tapping the brakes on religious beliefs or experiences at certain moments, right? So I guess two-part question. One is, how do you read the current state of that literature, if you feel comfortable talking about that? And so what and who cares, right? Because an easy read on this is, oh, well, if you're a careful, thoughtful, analytic thinker, you're less likely to be religious. So only dumb people will be religious. Is that provocative enough, organizers? Is that all right?
I'm happy to say something about the first part of this, but Jordan, do you want to start?
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I'll leave you the hard part. I'll tell you my read of some of this literature, although Justin, you might know some of the latest ins and outs more than I do. I mean, for those of you in the audience who don't know this, there were a handful of papers, I think it was 2 or 3 that came out initially that found an association between reflective thought and being non-religious versus sort of going with your gut, your first intuitive reaction, rather than overriding it by explicit subsequent thought. So my understanding of that is that it seems like that's probably a real correlation in a small number of locations and contexts, and the United States happens to be one of them. And when you look much more broadly, you don't find that correlation so robustly. And so how do we make sense of that? I mean, I think that challenges the idea that humans as a group are the kinds of creatures who tend towards religious ideas when they're non-reflective. I don't think we have any good evidence for that. What I think we do have evidence for is that being the sort of person who's willing to endorse a counter-normative belief, i.e. a belief that is not the dominant one that your culture hands you, that requires reflective thinking and analytic thinking and being willing to just kind of override the easy, immediate, familiar answer. And so I think what that predicts is that if you're in a cultural context where the culture hands you a particular religious belief, and those people who go counter to that dominant religious narrative are going to tend to be more reflective and analytic. But you could imagine flipping the context there and having a culture where the default belief is non-religious, and there you'd expect to perhaps have the opposite emerge. I think there might be a couple of, I don't want to get this wrong. I'm tempted to say that maybe data from Hong Kong suggests that it goes the other way, but I'm not totally confident. I don't know if either of you knows that. So that's my take on the first part of your question. I'll leave the harder part for Jordan. I don't know which part he wants to pick up.
Let me give you a sort of an out of religion example, but maybe it has some relationship to beliefs and all. I grew up in Chicago, and I am a longtime Chicago Cubs fan. And I wrote a chapter actually on the social cognition of Chicago Cubs fans, and why it required thinking in creative and ways that very conceptual ways that actually enhanced your thinking, because you were always thinking they were going to win the next year. You had a belief system which was never validated by the experience of the team every year until 2016. I had a supernatural experience. I'm watching the Cubs on TV. They win the World Series, and out of the corner of my perception, I see a blotch of redness leaving my body, going into the air. I look around and I say, what is that? What is happening there? And you could say you're expunging all the years of pain and suffering as they won. So I guess what I want to say is that there is some relationship with other forms of belief and intensity of belief and counterintuitive thinking that is not so different from what we might experience with religious belief. And I guess many of us, and I assume you're in this situation as well, Justin, part of our interest is, when we think about cognitive processes, is why they emerged in the first place. Why did religious belief emerge? Was it simply to help coalesce small groups to try to control the influence of clans and families, and to try to create larger sorts of rules by which you would behave? I mean, there's all sorts of explanations for this. And part of the way we might understand that better is by understanding the commonality of the brain regions that are involved in both those kinds of social behaviors and religious beliefs. So I sort of avoided a little bit your second question. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. I like both of your answers. It reminds me of, I've got a lifelong friend who once commented to me. He said, Justin, you're smart enough to convince yourself of lots of really stupid things. And I've really taken that to heart. It keeps me humble, but he was making Tania's point, I think. And that is to sort of go counter narrative, to be creative, to be innovative, sometimes takes these sort of conceptual override types of things. And so then the findings, my understanding of the literature is similar to yours. The effect sizes are small and they're highly contextual.
Yeah, I might also add, and I don't know about your case, Tania, or your in your studies, Justin, we tend to study people who I believe tend to rely more on heuristic thinking about religion. That is, they might have read the Bible once, they might go to church on Sunday, say, for example, but they're not professionals at it. So one of the gaps, I think, in studying, besides us only studying weird groups, westernized, educated groups, is also the fact that we tend not to study experts often, that it's the rare study where you study priests or rabbis or imams, and so forth. So I think that's another issue. You don't need didactic, at least in our experience with our studies, you don't need didactic training to feel deeply religious. So the kind of intellectual processes that are often involved in didactic training, for example, questioning what you're reading, even in the Bible, that people may experience, the average citizen may not be doing that as well. So that is another issue that you have to be aware of when you're doing studies. I think, I don't want to press the funding aspect, but with less funding, you don't have quite the ability to cover the range of issues that you need to get better answers to the questions that we've raised.
I'm curious about something you said there, Tania, in your presentation. One of your findings had to do with the increase in confidence. Well, whether someone's confidence in their belief should go up if they have a non-pathological, a non-abnormal scientific explanation for it. But I don't quite follow why my confidence should go up in those cases. So could you illuminate that for us?
Yes, I'm happy to do that because we were very puzzled by this initially. We thought that maybe even in those cases, people would find it threatening, right? Just saying, Justin, your religious belief X is due to this particular brain process. And here's what we sort of came to is what we think is going on. What we typically did when we described these studies, we'd say, for example, there were lots of versions of it, but one might be you participated in a study in Jordan's lab and you went into the fMRI scanner, and as you were endorsing your belief that God exists, they found type M neural activation, or I think we made up a brain area a couple times, which was fun. Something like that, which is a type of brain activity associated with religious belief, or is a type of brain activity associated with scientific belief, or whatever the domain was. And we took that to be a very neutral claim. But what I think we were communicating to participants is that your brain region was operating normally in the way that it ought to. It was operating properly because we saw the type of pattern we expect in that case. And so I think they actually took what we took to be very neutral statements, not just to be denying abnormality, but to be endorsing some sort of proper functioning. And if it was working properly, then that's great. I have all the more confidence in the outputs of that process.
That strikes me as plausible. You remind me of, I once, one of the pastors at a church I was attending shared a story with us where he was having, the way he relayed this is that he was worshiping in church and then was struck by this off-putting concern that he wasn't really directing his prayers or adoration at anyone outside. It was just sort of a mind game he was playing on himself. And he claims that shortly thereafter, maybe the next day, he was listening to a radio interview about a neuroscience of religion study. I believe this was one of Uffe Schutz out of the Aarhus group, where they found that spontaneous prayer activated these theory of mind regions, the same types of regions as in the control condition if you were directing a conversation to somebody else. And he took assurance in this that at least it was the right part of the brain doing the work, that it would be if he were talking to a normal person, and took some comfort in that. So maybe that's along the lines you're suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that example.
Okay, now I'm getting some questions showing up here on the chat. So let's, don't let this cut the two of you off from talking to each other as well, but let's see here. Here's a question. I'm curious if the need to believe in God or the inability to believe in God is something that is neurologically built in our mind. Is it possible that some people have to believe, whereas others cannot believe even if they wanted to? I guess I'm looking for a reason for the kind of unshakable faith people have versus a resistance to accept the presence of a higher power. Okay, built in neurologically.
That had neurological, so I'm looking at you, Jordan.
Yes, you are. So I think the brain is designed to believe, right? And I think the belief process is at least partly needed to understand our world, what goes on around us. We see something, what does it mean? I have to trust it or not trust it. If I trust it and it occurs again, well, I understand it better because now I believe in something about it. So I think the brain is designed for that. And it's designed for that partly because that kind of stuff is really important in social interactions. You want to understand and believe. If somebody tells you something, do you believe them or not? It's time for dinner. Do you believe it's time for dinner? If so, maybe you're going to go. If not, you're going to go on and do your other task. And it helps make the world less chaotic when you have beliefs. Part of the problem, at least I think in some of our studies, comes when those beliefs are not tempered in some way by knowledge. So there has to be a meeting in the brain between facts, things that we know why they occur, versus beliefs, which are not always backed up by facts. And that's a big challenge. So I'll give you an example. Can I give another example? Do we have time? Okay. So about 20 years ago, my mom died. And this was a few nights after she died. And I always get up. I get up very early. I'm up at 3:30 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And I'm going to work. At that time, I lived at the NIH. I worked at the NIH and I lived in Bethesda. And so I'm walking and it's very dark. And I look across the street and then there's my mom. I see my mom. It's a perceptual experience of my mom walking. So I looked away because it's a little shocking because I knew she was dead. And I look back and she's gone. So I have a perceptual phenomena there. And I'm a scientist and I'm interested in the brain and how it works. And I could come up with some explanations of that would temper the experience, that would say, okay, I saw my mom, but there's lots of reasons that that image might emerge from my memory. I have that explanation available to me. This is why science and knowledge is really important, of the kind that Tania does and Justin does, because we can then resort to that as at least a partial explanation. It doesn't devalue the experience. The experience itself is something a little bit separate from its reality. And the reality was, I know my mom wasn't there. She wasn't there, but I felt like she was. So I think what happens is the mind is structured early on to process perceptual experiences in many different ways and use those perceptual experiences to guide behavior. Facts and knowledge are superimposed upon that to help modulate those perceptual experiences in a way that makes our life more reasonable, understandable, successful in achieving goals, etc. So there can be, and we've seen it recently, there are always conflicts between beliefs and facts. And it's how you, in your own brain, that happens all the time. And you have to have some sort of an agreement, a handshake between the two that helps modulate what is otherwise potentially unexplainable.
Thanks. Yeah, it's, you noted earlier the importance of some of our social cognition in, the question was specifically about God beliefs. And those of us working in cognitive science of religion, and you sort of went that way too, have often pointed to a lot of these social cognition kinds of mechanisms like theory of mind and the importance of them. If you're going to have a personal God and you're going to have to believe in that, well, it seems reasonable that that's a whole lot easier if you have a good sort of rigorous theory of mind system. So you might predict, and the data on this are mixed, that people who don't have quite as robust a theory of mind system might find it harder to think about a personal God. It's just not quite as intuitive. Getting in God's head is a little bit harder because it's harder to get into anybody's head. The reason why these data are mixed with regard to then predicting people's degree of theism is there are other ways to get to belief. One of those is to act your way to belief. So people on autism spectrum disorder, or what are we calling it these days now, who might have a diminished kind of theory of mind may actually be attracted to a lot of the ritualized forms of religious participation and become very committed through that pathway, as opposed to sort of through the I'm reading God's mind pathway, as it were. So it's complex, right? Let's see, what other questions do we have here? Is atheism a form of belief as well, and therefore may it be interesting to study? Who wants to take that one?
Tania.
I'm happy to take that. I think the short answer is yes, and that it's a great question, and that I wished you'd asked it to the scientific discipline about 20 years ago, because I think it's been late for the cognitive science of religion to catch on to the question of religious belief with a focus on atheism, as opposed to religious belief with a focus on belief in gods. So I'd say, maybe in the last 10 years, there's started to be really fascinating, great, interesting studies that are asking general questions about belief by focusing on atheism, sometimes called unbelief as well. And the other point I'd make in this context is just that, beliefs have all sorts of characteristics that we hold for all sorts of reasons. And people can be, when people have a religious belief, it often plays lots of roles for them. They take it to be an accurate claim about what's true in the world. It's important to their identity. It's important to their communities and to their social relationships. It plays a role in how they relate to people and activities they engage in. And overwhelmingly, that's not true for atheists. And so I think even though they are both beliefs, on average, they tend to play very different kinds of psychological roles for people. And so there end up being interestingly different questions about how people get to those beliefs and then what kinds of roles those beliefs play.
Well said. Very good. Yeah. Yeah, there is a nice push in recent years, and you're right, in the last 10 years of a lot more devoted work to looking at the scientific study of atheism, and realizing there are all of these different varieties of atheism as well. We've got a question about, has there been the sort of scientific research on religion in places where Christianity or even monotheism isn't the dominant religion? My understanding is most of the cognitive, I can speak to the cognitive science of religion, tons of it done outside of sort of, the West. And there, what you'll see is different emphases on different kinds of beliefs as well. So there may, in those scientific studies, be more of a focus on, say, belief in ancestor spirits, afterlife, ritualized behaviors of different sorts, pre-life beliefs. So what were you doing before you were born? Where do those beliefs come from? What are the cognitive mechanisms that seem to drive those? Among others, karma is starting to be looked at as well, reincarnation beliefs. So yes, there are studies being done. Still early days for there to be sort of emerging consensuses about these sorts of things, is my impression. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Well, I think the one thing to add is that they're all amenable to cognitive science study. Even if they're different forms of belief, you can study them in different ways using different ideas about how cognitive processing occurs. So understudied, perhaps to some degree, maybe a little bit, certainly in cognitive neuroscience, that's the case. Almost all cognitive neuroscience is done in European, of religious beliefs are done in European and United States, as opposed to non-weird countries, that's for sure.
I'm sensitive to the clock here. This looks like this is a clarification question for Tania. What's the definition of a mystery?
Good question. I won't say it's a mystery or it's unknown. That would be cheating. So we actually wondered about how our participants were interpreting this, because we had two sorts of different hypotheses about how people might understand that question. So if you say, why is there God? It's a mystery. Someone could take that to itself actually constitute an explanation, or they could take it to be something like an abdication from explaining. And so we tried to figure out how people were interpreting it, and it turns out it was more like the latter. So it's kind of like, at least from the data we have in our studies, it seems like people take mystery to be something like a halt to inquiry. It's sort of like a sign that says, don't pursue this further. What's true for me might not be true for you. There might be no fact of the matter. It might be beyond comprehension. We might not be able to know. By contrast, if you say it's a known, that's saying, look, here's this territory to go inquire and explore. And so even though they're both in some sense forms of ignorance, they seem to be related to inquiry and to our assumptions about what's valuable to aspire to understand really differently. I think it's a much broader question. I'm just responding to the sort of slice of what we've measured in our studies. Yeah.
It was asked, what are the most disruptive implications for religious studies arising from the research you've shared tonight? And I take it, let me read into that a little bit, that it's not just for the academic study of religion, but maybe for religious beliefs, practices, devotion, whatever. What's the stuff that you think really religious people ought to be worried about, as well as religious studies scholars? Well, you're just too polite. Look at you. But there's nothing here to be worried about. Come on, there's got to be something.
I think if you come up with a fairly complete explanation in the brain, anyway, in the human brain, of the relationship of thinking about religious beliefs to other forms of belief, the kinds of work that Tania was doing and talking about. And you find there's really a whole lot of overlap and nothing distinctive. Does it create fear that that's just simply going to explain away the reality of God? How about that? Let's put it right where it's at. If there is no God, gods, you choose your religion. I'm not just talking about Christianity. If there's no such thing as God at all, where does that leave us in how we deal with all the problems and issues in life? That's really difficult for a lot of people. And so is by investigating this stuff in the brain a safe way to coming to that conclusion? Because it's science, it's in your brain, you're not concerned with supernatural beings, for example. I mean, we're not there. Somebody can come back and say, you can't prove whether there's a God or not. Well, that's true. We're not studying that. We're not doing that. That's a science paper, by the way, if God comes into the lab, but right now hasn't happened. So I would say that that's a bit of the controversy, a bit of the disruption in what we're doing. And also, if people prefer that religious belief continue to be a mystery and that the belief settles in our brains as it has, and we don't want to know actually much more about it, and we're compelled as scientists to learn more. I'm driven to learn more. Then I think it's that kind of conflict potentially is inevitable as well. Although I must say, in the past, I've been on Catholic radio and other sorts of religious media, and I've never had any issues with anybody when they've called in. I mean, everybody's interested and curious, and the conversation has been very cool.
I say just to end on a provocative note, I guess I would say that one hypothesis that I think is consistent with a lot of the research in my lab and things I see going on in other work is the idea that religious beliefs serve a psychological function that is distinct from and potentially orthogonal to tracking the truth or aiming at sort of an accurate description of the world. That a lot of our religious beliefs serve functions related to social cohesion, perhaps moral regulation, and so on. And so I think that's an interesting question. If it turns out their psychological role is really different from a kind of truth tracking or accuracy oriented psychological role, I would be really fascinated to hear how people approaching this from theology and from a religious perspective would want to try to make sense of that within their belief system.